The forest was alive with whispers. Not the kind that rustled through leaves, or the distant hoot of an owl, but something darker. More deliberate. It was as if the trees themselves were conspiring, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal fingers, pointing the way. Thomas Mercer didn't believe in witches. Not really. But desperation has a way of bending belief, of making the impossible seem plausible. And Thomas? He was desperate. His daughter, Emily, was dying. The doctors had given up. They called it a rare blood disorder, something they couldn't name, let alone cure. Her tiny body was failing, her once bright eyes now sunken and dull. Thomas had sold everything, the car, the house, even his wedding ring, to pay for treatments that did nothing. He was out of options. Out of hope. That's when he heard about the witch. It was an old story, passed down in hushed tones by the locals. Deep in the Black Hollow woods, they said, lived a woman who could grant miracles for a price. No one ever spoke of what that price was, only that those who sought her out rarely returned. But Thomas didn't care. He would risk anything for Emily. Now, as he trudged through the dense undergrowth, the air grew colder, thicker. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows lengthening despite the midday sun. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they formed words. Turn back. Thomas ignored them. He clutched the crumpled map in his hand, the one he'd traded a bottle of whiskey for at the town's dingy bar. The ink was faded, the lines barely visible, but he could make out the crude drawing of a gnarled tree with a hollow at its base. That was where he would find her. The tree loomed ahead, its trunk twisted and blackened, as if scorched by fire. The hollow was just as the map had described, a gaping maw in the wood, dark and foreboding. Thomas hesitated, his breath visible in the icy air. He could feel the weight of the forest pressing down on him, the whispers now a cacophony in his ears. Leave. Leave now. I'm here, he shouted, his voice trembling. I need your help. For a moment, there was silence. Then, from the depths of the hollow, a figure emerged. She was tall, her body draped in tattered black robes that seemed to shift and writhe like living shadows. Her face was obscured by a hood, but Thomas could feel her eyes on him, piercing and cold. When she spoke, her voice was a rasp, like the scrape of a blade against bone. Why have you come? Thomas swallowed hard, his throat dry. My daughter, she's sick. The doctors can't help her. I'll do anything, pay anything, to save her. The witch tilted her head, considering him. Anything? Yes. She stepped closer, and Thomas caught a glimpse of her face beneath the hood. His stomach churned. Her skin was pale and cracked, like porcelain left too long in the sun. In her eyes, they were black, endless voids that seemed to swallow the light. Very well, she said, her lips curling into a smile that revealed jagged, yellow teeth. I can save your daughter. But the price is not one you can pay with gold or trinkets. What do you want? Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The witch reached out a hand, her fingers long and claw-like. A piece of you. Thomas frowned. What do you mean? Your soul, she said simply. A fragment of it, to be exact. I will take a small piece, and in return, your daughter will live. Thomas's heart pounded in his chest. His soul? Was such a thing even possible? But then he thought of Emily, her frail body hooked up to machines, her weak smile as she told him not to worry. He would give anything for her. Even this. Do it, he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. The witch's smile widened. A wise choice. She reached out, her hand hovering over his chest. Thomas felt a sudden, searing pain, as if something were being ripped from deep within him. He gasped, his vision blurring, and for a moment, he thought he might pass out. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the pain subsided. The witch stepped back, her hand clutching a small, glowing orb. It pulsed with a faint light, like a dying ember. Thomas stared at it, a strange emptiness settling in his chest. It is done, the witch said. Your daughter will live. But remember, Thomas Mercer, every bargain has consequences. Before he could respond, she vanished into the hollow, the forest swallowing her as if she had never been there at all. Thomas returned home to find Emily sitting up in bed, her cheeks flushed with color. The doctors were baffled, calling it a miracle. Thomas didn't care what they called it. His daughter was alive, and that was all that mattered. At first, everything seemed perfect. Emily grew stronger every day, her laughter filling the house once more. But Thomas couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The emptiness in his chest lingered, a constant reminder of the price he had paid. Then the nightmares began. Every night, he dreamed of the witch. She stood at the foot of his bed, her black eyes boring into him, her voice echoing in his mind. "You owe me." He would wake in a cold sweat, his heart racing, the words ringing in his ears. At first, he tried to dismiss it as guilt, the lingering effects of his desperation. But the dreams grew more vivid, more terrifying. He began to see her during the day, fleeting glimpses out of the corner of his eye. A shadow moving where there should be none. A whisper in an empty room. One night, as he lay in bed, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned, expecting to see nothing, but there she was, her face inches from his. "You thought it would be so simple," she hissed. "A small piece of your soul, and all would be well. But a soul is not so easily divided." Thomas tried to scream, but no sound came out. The witch's hand tightened on his shoulder, her nails digging into his flesh. "You owe me," she repeated. "And I always collect." The days blurred together. Thomas stopped sleeping, afraid of what he might see in his dreams. He became paranoid, convinced that the witch was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. He started seeing her everywhere, in the reflection of a window, in the flicker of a candle flame, in the shadows that danced on the walls. Emily noticed the change in him. "Daddy, what's wrong?" she asked one evening, her small hand on his arm. Thomas forced a smile. "Nothing, sweetheart. Just tired." But he wasn't fooling anyone. His hands shook constantly, his eyes darting around the room as if expecting the witch to appear at any moment. He stopped eating, stopped caring about anything except the growing sense of dread that consumed him. One night, as he sat alone in the living room, the lights flickered. The air grew cold, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. "You owe me." Thomas clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. The room went silent. For a moment, he thought it was over. Then the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. He heard a soft, rhythmic tapping, like footsteps approaching. His breath came in short, panicked gasps as he fumbled for the flashlight on the table. The beam of light illuminated the room, and Thomas froze. The witch stood before him, her black eyes gleaming, her smile twisted into a grotesque mockery of kindness. "It's time," she said. Thomas tried to back away, but his legs wouldn't obey. The witch reached out, her hand closing around his throat. He felt the same searing pain as before, but this time it was worse, so much worse. It felt as if his very essence was being torn apart, piece by piece. When it was over, Thomas collapsed to the floor, his body trembling. The witch stood over him, her hand clutching another glowing orb. This one was larger, brighter, its light almost blinding. "You should have read the fine print," she said, her voice dripping with malice. "The first piece was just the down payment. The rest, well, let's just say I always collect in full." Thomas tried to speak, but his voice was gone. His vision blurred, the edges of the room fading into darkness. The last thing he saw was the witch's smile as she vanished into the shadows. Emily found him the next morning, his body cold and lifeless. The doctors called it a heart attack, but she knew better. She had seen the change in him, the way he had slowly unraveled. She didn't understand what had happened, but she knew one thing for certain. Her father had made a bargain. And it had cost him everything.